Our story starts with Mike, a guy you'd probably like if you met him. He's in his early 40s, the kind of man who keeps to himself but isn't shy about sharing a laugh over a beer with friends. A family man at heart, Mike works as a project manager for a mid-sized tech company, and he's got a life most people would envy. A solid job, a nice home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and, of course, a loving family. Or so he thought. His wife, Emily, had been his best friend for almost 2 decades. They met in college, one of those classic stories where they instantly clicked and couldn't be kept apart. She was the outgoing one, lighting up any room with her laugh and bubbly personality, while he was the steady rock beside her. Emily worked in marketing for a well-known firm, and her career had been steadily rising over the years. Together, they had 2 kids, Sarah and Luke, both in high school, and Mike honestly thought they were living the dream. Maybe not the flashy, adventurous kind, but the stable, comfortable life he'd always wanted. But as anyone will tell you, life doesn't always go as planned. Over the past few months, Mike had noticed some subtle changes in Emily. She'd always been a hard worker, but recently, she'd been putting in extra hours, staying late at the office more often than usual, and even going on overnight work trips. At first, Mike didn't think too much of it. After all, Emily's dedication to her job was one of the things he admired most about her. But gradually, little things started to stand out. Emily was always on her phone, texting with her screen turned away from him or excusing herself to take calls in another room. When he'd casually ask who she was talking to, she'd brush it off, saying it was just work stuff. Then, she'd started coming home with new clothes, designer bags, and even expensive perfumes she'd never shown interest in before. It was as if she was putting on a show for someone who definitely wasn't Mike. One Friday night, as they sat down for dinner, Mike couldn't shake off a strange feeling gnawing at him. Emily was there, right across from him, but her mind seemed miles away. She'd laughed at his jokes, answered his questions, but there was a distance in her eyes that hadn't been there before. He brushed it off at first, thinking maybe he was just being paranoid. But when Emily brought up a corporate retreat her company was organizing, a weekend-long event at a luxury lodge in the mountains, he couldn't help but feel that familiar unease. "Another work trip?" he asked, trying to keep his tone lighthearted. "Yeah, it's a big deal," Emily replied, almost too casually. "Everyone from the team is going, and I kind of have to be there. It'll just be the weekend." Mike forced a smile. "Well, I hope you have fun. Just don't forget to relax a little." But Emily barely reacted to his comment, quickly returning her attention to her plate, leaving Mike feeling as if he'd just been brushed off. For some reason, that conversation stayed with him, lingering in his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. The weekend of the corporate retreat finally came, and Mike found himself alone in a quiet house. Sarah was at a friend's, and Luke was busy with a sports tournament, so it was just him, his thoughts, and that nagging feeling. He told himself he was overthinking things, but the longer he sat there, the harder it was to ignore. Curiosity got the better of him. He knew it wasn't right, but he picked up Emily's iPad from the kitchen counter. She'd left it logged in, and part of him felt guilty for even thinking about snooping. But another part, driven by that insistent gut feeling, couldn't resist. He opened her messages, and there, between a series of work-related chats, was a name he didn't recognize. Jason. Mike's heart raced as he read through the messages. They started off innocently enough, discussing project details, office meetings, and deadlines. But as he scrolled further, the tone changed. Jason and Emily had been exchanging messages that went far beyond friendly conversation. There were compliments, inside jokes, and even a few suggestive comments that made Mike's stomach turn. He put the iPad down, hands shaking, 1,000 thoughts racing through his mind. This couldn't be happening. Emily, his best friend, his partner, was she really hiding something from him? He decided to confront her, but he knew he had to be smart about it. If he went in guns blazing, he might not get the answers he needed. So he waited for her to come home, planning to approach her calmly. Sunday evening arrived, and Emily returned from her retreat, looking refreshed and carrying a new designer handbag he'd never seen before. She greeted him with a quick peck on the cheek, but there was something in her eyes that confirmed his worst suspicions. That distance was still there, a wall between them that he hadn't built but now felt every day. As they sat down for dinner, Mike decided to take a different approach. He casually brought up her work retreat, asking her about her coworkers, mentioning names, and finally slipping in Jason's name to see her reaction. The change in her expression was slight, but enough. Her eyes flickered for a second before she composed herself, brushing it off with a quick, "Oh, he's new in the department. We just worked on a few projects together." Mike didn't press further that night, but he could feel the tension growing. He didn't sleep much, replaying the entire weekend in his head, wondering how he'd missed the signs and what his next move should be. It was as if his world had shifted, and he was left trying to find his balance. The following week, things felt off. Emily's work hours stayed long. Her phone was practically glued to her hand, and Mike's instincts were screaming at him. He decided he couldn't just sit around waiting for answers. That Friday, he made a plan. He'd head over to Emily's office building after work and wait nearby, hoping to catch a glimpse of her leaving. Maybe he was overreacting, but he needed to know the truth. As he waited in his car that evening, he felt his nerves kicking in. He hadn't told anyone what he was doing, not even his closest friend, Mark. He couldn't risk word getting out, not until he knew what was really going on. So, he sat there in the parking lot, eyes fixed on the entrance, watching as employees slowly trickled out. Finally, he saw her. Emily walked out of the building, but she wasn't alone. Standing beside her, laughing at something she'd said, was a man he assumed had to be Jason. They walked together, close enough that their shoulders brushed, their laughter floating into the night as they strolled towards the parking garage. Mike's heart sank as he watched them, unable to move, unable to look away. After a few moments, Emily and Jason stopped near a sleek black car. He opened the door for her, and she climbed in, her expression relaxed and carefree. They drove off together, and Mike just sat there, his mind reeling with everything he'd just seen. He knew he had to confront her, but he also knew that if he did it in the heat of the moment, he'd probably lose control. So, he drove home, trying to gather his thoughts, preparing himself for a conversation he'd never imagined he'd have. When Emily walked through the door later that night, Mike was ready. He waited until she was settled, casually bringing up her night, asking her how the office was. Emily, clearly caught off guard by his sudden interest, hesitated before replying, trying to keep her answers vague. But Mike wasn't letting it go this time. He asked her directly about Jason, about what he'd seen. At first, she denied everything, laughing off his questions like they were absurd. But as he pressed, her expression shifted, and Mike could see the cracks in her story start to show. She finally admitted to spending time with Jason, claiming they were just friends, colleagues who liked each other's company. As Emily tried to brush off Mike's questions about Jason, Mike felt his frustration growing. Her tone was light, her laugh forced, but her eyes couldn't hide the truth. The harder she tried to dodge his questions, the more determined Mike became to get to the bottom of things. She kept insisting that Jason was just a friend, that Mike was being paranoid, but Mike couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this friendship than she was letting on. After that conversation, Mike decided to give her one more chance to come clean. Maybe, he thought, if he backed off a little, she'd realize she could talk to him openly like they used to. He didn't want to be the jealous husband, and he knew that constantly pushing her would only drive a deeper wedge between them. But the tension was eating away at him. The following days were quiet. Emily acted as if nothing had happened, but Mike could feel the distance between them widening. She was still on her phone constantly, and her work hours seemed to get longer and longer. Mike felt trapped, unsure of what to do, and he found himself looking forward to the weekend, when they planned a family day out. It would be a chance to reconnect, to remember what really mattered. But when Saturday arrived, Emily said she had to work. Again. She promised she'd try to get home early, but Mike could tell from the look on her face that she had no intention of being there. As he watched her leave, the frustration finally reached a breaking point. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, and he definitely couldn't keep waiting for her to come clean. So he made a decision. If Emily wasn't going to tell him the truth, he'd find it himself. Mike spent the weekend doing some research. He scrolled through Emily's social media profiles, checked her recent messages, even went through old photos to see if there were any clues he'd missed. But nothing concrete came up. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. He needed answers, and he'd get them one way or another. On Monday, while Emily was at work, Mike decided to drive down to her office building. He parked nearby, hoping to catch a glimpse of her and, possibly, Jason. He felt a bit ridiculous sitting there, like some kind of amateur detective, but he couldn't deny that his instincts were pushing him to stay. And just when he was beginning to think he was wasting his time, he saw her. Emily walked out of the building with Jason by her side, and they seemed deep in conversation. There was a familiarity between them, an ease that stung Mike more than he expected. As he watched, Jason reached out, brushing his hand against Emily's arm. She laughed, looking up at him with a smile that Mike hadn't seen in a long time. The sight was like a punch to the gut. He'd been right all along. At that moment, something inside Mike shifted. This wasn't just a case of jealousy. This was real. Emily's actions were real, and the betrayal he'd feared was right in front of him. He realized he had two choices. Confront her now, letting the anger take over, or take his time, gather more information, and plan his next steps carefully. He chose the latter. Over the next few weeks, Mike kept a closer eye on Emily. Every time she mentioned another late night at the office or a work event, he quietly noted it. He became more aware of her routines, paying attention to her schedule, and even using a tracking app to see if her location matched what she told him. He was shocked at how easily the lies flowed from her, how effortlessly she maintained the illusion of a devoted wife while sneaking off to see Jason. It was as if she was living a double life, and Mike was merely a bystander. One evening, when Emily came home later than usual, Mike decided he couldn't hold back any longer. As soon as she walked in, he confronted her directly. "Emily," he said, his voice steady but his eyes fierce, "I know about Jason. I know what's going on between you two." Emily froze, her face a mix of shock and guilt. But instead of apologizing or trying to explain, she turned defensive. "Mike, you're blowing this way out of proportion. Jason is just a friend. Nothing more. You're being paranoid." But Mike wasn't backing down this time. A friend? Friends don't lie about where they're going. Friends don't spend every spare moment together, and they certainly don't hide things from their spouses. Emily's expression hardened, and for the first time, Mike saw a side of her he didn't recognize. "Maybe if you trusted me," she snapped, "we wouldn't be having this conversation." Mike felt a mix of anger and hurt rising inside him. He had trusted her, more than she knew. And now, with her standing there, deflecting blame instead of facing the truth, he realized that the woman he'd loved all these years wasn't the same person anymore. That night, Mike slept on the couch. The silence between them grew thicker, and the once warm home they built together felt cold and empty. In the days that followed, they barely spoke. Emily went about her routine as if nothing had changed. But Mike knew better. He could see the cracks forming, and he wasn't sure if anything could mend them. Desperate for advice, Mike reached out to his friend Mark. Mark had known him and Emily since college, and if anyone would understand, it would be him. They met up for coffee, and as Mike poured out the story, Mark listened quietly, his face a mixture of empathy and anger on Mike's behalf. "So, what are you going to do?" Mark asked after a long silence. Mike shrugged. "I don't know, man. I thought I'd be angrier, but mostly, I'm just lost. This is the woman I thought I'd spend my life with. I never imagined it would come to this." Mark placed a hand on his shoulder. "Listen, Mike, you deserve honesty. And if she can't give you that, then you need to do what's best for you." It was the wake-up call Mike needed. He realized that he couldn't keep living in denial, hoping things would go back to the way they were. If Emily couldn't be honest with him, then he needed to take control of his own happiness, even if it meant making the hardest decision of his life. That evening, when he got home, Mike sat Emily down and told her plainly, "I can't keep pretending everything's okay. If you're not willing to be honest with me, then maybe we need to reconsider this marriage." Emily looked at him, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, Mike thought he saw a flicker of remorse. but it was quickly replaced by anger. "So, that's it?" she demanded. "You're just giving up on us?" Mike sighed. "No, Emily. I'm not the one who gave up. You did the moment you started lying to me. I love you, but I can't be in a marriage that's built on lies." For the first time, the reality of the situation seemed to hit her. She sat there, silent, staring down at her hands. But when she finally looked up, there was a defiance in her eyes. "Fine. If that's how you feel, maybe we should end this. Maybe it's for the best." Mike felt a mix of relief and sorrow. Part of him had hoped she'd fight for them, that she'd see the damage her actions had caused and want to make things right. But instead, she was choosing her pride over their marriage. As he packed a bag that night, Mike felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He'd spent weeks torturing himself, questioning everything he thought he knew about his wife, his marriage, and his life. But now, as he took his first steps toward a new beginning, he realized he was ready to let go. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't facing the truth. It's accepting that the person you loved isn't who you thought they were. And in that moment, Mike knew he was finally ready to move on. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to leave a comment below about what you'd do in Mike's situation. Would you have handled things the same way? Let us know. As Mike packed up his things that night, a sense of numbness settled over him. It was surreal. Just a few months ago, he had been living a life he thought was secure and predictable. And now, here he was, leaving the home he'd shared with Emily for years. Every corner of their house held memories, a life they'd built together, yet now it felt like a place he no longer belonged. But before he walked out that door, Mike found himself hesitating. Despite everything, the lies, the betrayal, part of him was still holding on. He paused, staring at the photos lining the hallway, pictures of family vacations, anniversaries, the kids when they were little. This was his family, his life. Leaving felt like tearing a piece of himself away. And maybe, just maybe, he thought there was a way to save it. The following morning, Mike decided to give it one last shot. He needed to know if Emily was willing to fight for their marriage or if she had truly checked out. Over breakfast, he put his heart on the table. "Emily," he said softly, "I don't want to leave, but I can't stay if things don't change. We've built too much together to let it all fall apart over this. Are you willing to work on this with me?" For a moment, Emily looked taken aback, and Mike thought he saw a glimmer of the woman he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. She set her coffee mug down and met his gaze. "Mike, I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I'm in a different place. I never wanted to hurt you, but I don't know if we're right for each other anymore." Her words cut deeper than Mike expected. After years of marriage, the thought that she was even questioning their bond was almost too much to bear. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "You're just giving up on us?" Emily looked away, unable to meet his eyes. She seemed conflicted, but Mike could see that she had already made her decision. She was holding on to her pride, unable or unwilling to admit that she'd made a mistake. And in that moment, Mike realized that there was nothing left to fight for. He took a deep breath, the weight of finality settling over him. "All right," he said, standing up. "If that's how you feel, then I guess there's nothing more to say." With that, he walked away, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and relief. He'd given her every chance to make things right, to rebuild what they had, and she'd chosen to walk away. It was painful, but at least now he had clarity. As Mike moved forward with the divorce proceedings, he found himself going through a whirlwind of emotions. On one hand, he felt a sense of freedom, like he was finally able to breathe again without constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next betrayal. But on the other, he couldn't shake the sadness of losing someone he'd loved for so long. The divorce process was draining, with meetings, paperwork, and the difficult conversations he had to have with Sarah and Luke. They'd taken the news hard, and Mike did his best to reassure them that they would always be a family, no matter what. Then came the day that he had to face Emily and Jason in person. Their divorce hearing was scheduled, and although Mike had been dreading it, he knew it was necessary. He was mentally prepared to see Emily, but when he saw Jason sitting beside her, the pain hit him all over again. The man who had stolen his wife, the person who had destroyed everything Mike had worked for, was right there in the same room, acting as if he belonged. Emily and Jason were both sitting in the front row, whispering to each other, barely acknowledging Mike's presence. Mike tried his best to stay calm, but the sight of them together was like a slap in the face. He kept his composure, reminding himself that this was the final step in closing this painful chapter of his life. The hearing went as expected. They divided assets, arranged custody for the kids, and by the end of it, Mike felt drained but strangely at peace. As he left the courtroom, he could feel the weight lifting off his shoulders. He was finally free from the lies, the betrayals, and the heartbreak. But as he walked to his car, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, and there was Emily, looking hesitant. She approached him, an expression of regret on her face. "Mike, I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. "I know I hurt you, and I'll probably regret this for the rest of my life. I just didn't know how to tell you." Mike stared at her, feeling a mix of emotions he couldn't quite put into words. He'd waited so long to hear her say those words, to show some sign of remorse. But now it felt hollow. The damage was done, and no amount of apologies could change that. "Emily," he replied, his tone calm but firm, "it's too late for apologies. We had something real, something worth fighting for, and you threw it away. I hope you find what you're looking for, but I'm moving on." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the parking lot. For the first time in months, he felt like he was finally in control of his life again. Over the next few weeks, Mike began focusing on himself and his kids. He threw himself into his work, spent quality time with Sarah and Luke, and even picked up a few hobbies he'd always been interested in. He was starting to rebuild his life piece by piece, rediscovering who he was outside of his marriage. One evening, while out with friends, he ran into an old acquaintance, a woman named Laura whom he'd known from work events years ago. They got to talking, and Mike found himself genuinely enjoying her company. She was kind, thoughtful, and easy to talk to, qualities he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Their conversation flowed naturally, and before he knew it, hours had passed. They exchanged numbers, and over the next few weeks, they started seeing each other more frequently. Laura brought a new light into Mike's life, helping him heal in ways he hadn't anticipated. She wasn't trying to replace Emily. Rather, she was helping him rediscover happiness. For the first time in a long while, Mike felt hopeful about the future. Meanwhile, word got back to him that Emily and Jason's relationship wasn't going as smoothly as they had expected. Jason, it turned out, had a bit of a wandering eye himself. Friends told Mike that he'd been seen flirting with other women, and that his and Emily's relationship had become strained. Mike couldn't deny a small sense of satisfaction at the irony, but he kept it to himself. He was focused on his own happiness now, not Emily's downfall. Months passed, and Mike's relationship with Laura grew stronger. She was supportive, understanding, and respected the boundaries Mike needed as he healed. They took things slow, letting their relationship grow naturally, and in time Mike realized that he was genuinely happy again. One evening, as they were out to dinner, Laura looked at him with a smile. "You know, Mike, I think you're one of the strongest people I know. Everything you've been through, and yet you still managed to come out the other side." Mike felt a warmth in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you, Laura. I don't know if I'd call myself strong, but I've learned a lot. I learned that sometimes, losing something can be the best thing that ever happens to you." Looking back, Mike realized that his journey had been painful but necessary. He had found a new life, a new happiness, and a new love that respected and valued him for who he was. And as he sat there with Laura, laughing and sharing stories, he knew that he had finally moved on from the past, ready to embrace whatever the future held. Remember, if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Mike's shoes? As Mike continued to rebuild his life, focusing on his relationship with Laura and finding peace with his kids, a sudden twist threw everything back into turmoil. One evening, as he was settling in for a quiet night, he got an unexpected phone call from none other than Emily. He hesitated before answering, a mix of curiosity and apprehension gnawing at him. Why was she calling now after all this time? With a deep breath, he answered, keeping his tone as neutral as possible. Hello. Emily's voice sounded shaky, almost desperate. Mike, I need to talk to you. It's important. Mike's instinct was to hang up, but something in her voice held him back. He'd spent years with this woman. He knew her better than anyone, and despite everything, he could tell that whatever was going on with her was serious. Reluctantly, he agreed to meet her for coffee the next day, warning himself to stay guarded. The next morning, he walked into the cafe, spotting Emily at a corner table. She looked different, tired and worn down in a way he hadn't seen before. When she saw him, her face softened, a glimmer of regret flashing in her eyes. Mike took a seat, folding his arms, waiting for her to speak. Thank you for meeting me, she began, her voice barely a whisper. Mike nodded, keeping his expression unreadable. What's going on, Emily? She hesitated, then took a deep breath. I know I hurt you, Mike. I know I made the biggest mistake of my life, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I thought you should know. Things with Jason, they're over. Mike couldn't help the flash of satisfaction that crossed his mind. He kept his expression calm, but inside he was curious. And why are you telling me this? Emily sighed, looking away. Because I realized too late what I'd given up. I thought I was chasing happiness, something new and exciting, but I ended up losing everything that mattered. She paused, her eyes filling with tears. I was wrong, Mike, about everything. Mike felt a mixture of emotions. Part of him wanted to forgive her, to offer some comfort, but he knew that he couldn't go back. Too much had happened and he'd come too far. Emily, I understand that you're sorry, but what's done is done. I've moved on. You made your choices and I made mine. She looked at him, her expression crumbling as she realized there was no going back. I know, Mike, she whispered. I needed you to know how much I regret it. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them lost in the memories of what they once had. For the first time, Mike felt a strange sense of closure. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the acknowledgement he'd needed to truly let go. He nodded, standing up and offering her a small smile. Take care of yourself, Emily. As he walked out of the cafe, he felt a lightness in his chest, a freedom he hadn't felt in a long time. The chapter with Emily was officially closed. But life, it seemed, wasn't done with its surprises. A few days later, Mike was at work when he received an urgent call from his son, Luke. His voice was frantic, barely holding back tears. Dad, it's Mom. She's been in an accident. Mike's heart dropped. Without a second thought, he rushed out, heading straight to the hospital where Emily had been admitted. When he arrived, he found Luke and Sarah waiting anxiously, their faces pale with worry. He pulled them both into a hug, doing his best to stay strong for them. The doctors informed him that Emily's injuries were severe, but she was stable. She had been in a car accident, and while she would recover, the process would be long and difficult. Mike felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Despite everything, he couldn't deny that he still cared about her, that she was the mother of his children, and that her well-being mattered to him. Over the next few weeks, Mike visited Emily regularly, often bringing the kids along to lift her spirits. Their interactions were polite, almost businesslike, but there was a newfound respect between them. Mike could see the remorse in her eyes every time she looked at him, and though he couldn't forget the past, he found himself letting go of the anger he'd been holding on to. One afternoon, as Mike sat by her bedside, Emily turned to him, her face pale and weary. Mike, I don't expect anything from you, but I need you to know how grateful I am for everything. Mike nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. You don't have to thank me, Emily. I'm here because we shared a life and I want what's best for you. We both made mistakes, but I think it's time to let go of the past. She smiled weakly, and for the first time, Mike felt a sense of closure that went beyond words. As the months passed, Emily continued to recover, and their relationship slowly evolved. They weren't exactly friends, but there was a mutual respect, a recognition of the life they had shared and the love they had once felt. Mike's relationship with Laura also grew stronger, and she was a constant source of support through the ups and downs. She understood his commitment to his kids and his willingness to help Emily in her time of need, and her compassion only deepened his feelings for her. Eventually, Emily was able to return home, and with time, both she and Mike settled into a new rhythm. They were no longer husband and wife, but they were family, bound by the years they'd shared and the children they both loved. Mike knew that he had finally moved on, that he was ready to embrace whatever the future held without bitterness or regret. Looking back, he realized that the hardest part of his journey had been accepting that sometimes love wasn't enough to keep two people together. But he also learned that letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing to carry forward the lessons and memories without letting them hold him back. And as he walked into a new chapter of his life, with Laura by his side and his kids by his heart, Mike knew he was finally at peace. Thank you for listening to this story. If you found it moving, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and let us know in the comments what you would have done in Mike's shoes. Sometimes, life throws unexpected challenges our way, and the only thing we can do is face them head-on. The tension between Mike and Emily had been building steadily, and with each passing day, Mike could feel the inevitable confrontation looming. He tried to be patient, to give Emily the chance to explain herself, to come clean. But it had become painfully clear that she wasn't going to be honest, and Mike was no longer willing to live in the shadows of her secrets. Then came the evening that changed everything. Emily had mentioned she'd be working late again, and Mike felt that familiar knot of frustration settle in his stomach. But this time, instead of sitting at home wondering, he decided to take action. He wanted proof of what he already knew deep down but couldn't bring himself to fully accept. So, after a quick call to his friend Mark to cover for him, Mike drove to Emily's office. Parking discreetly a few blocks away, he found a spot with a clear view of the entrance. His heart pounded in his chest, and he was half hoping he wouldn't find anything. Maybe he was wrong, maybe she really was just working late, and he'd finally have the peace of mind he'd been craving. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. As he watched, time passed slowly, and with each minute, his doubt turned into dread. And then, there it was, the confirmation he'd been dreading. Emily exited the building, but she wasn't alone. Jason was right there beside her, and their body language left no room for doubt. They walked closely, speaking in hushed tones, and when they thought no one was watching, Jason reached out, holding her hand. Mike felt a wave of nausea, his world spinning as the reality of the situation crashed down on him. He was witnessing the betrayal firsthand, and there was no way to unsee it. Emily had crossed a line he never thought she'd even approach. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as he tried to steady his breathing. The pain was overwhelming, but more than that, he felt an anger rising within him that he hadn't experienced before. He wanted to confront her right then and there, but he knew it wasn't the right moment. Instead, he sat in his car, gathering his thoughts, preparing himself for the difficult conversation he knew was waiting for him back at home. By the time he finally drove back, he'd made up his mind. He needed the truth, and he wasn't leaving until he had it. When Emily walked through the door later that night, Mike was waiting for her, his face unreadable. She froze when she saw him, sensing immediately that something was off. He motioned for her to sit down, and she hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. But the look in his eyes left no room for argument. "Emily," he began, his voice calm but laced with a controlled intensity, "we need to talk." She looked at him, her face a mask of confusion mixed with guilt. "Mike, what's going on?" He took a deep breath, holding her gaze. "I know about Jason. I saw you tonight, Emily. I know everything." Her face paled, and for a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. But then, to Mike's disbelief, she tried to turn it around. "Mike, it's not what it looks like. Jason and I are just friends. We were discussing a work project." "Don't," he interrupted, his tone sharp. "Don't insult me by lying again. I saw you. I saw how you looked at him, how he held your hand. Don't stand here and pretend it was just work. Emily's defenses crumbled, and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Mike could see the guilt in her eyes, the regret she hadn't been willing to admit. But instead of apologizing, she stayed silent, as if searching for the right words to justify her actions. Mike continued, his voice steady. I need you to be honest with me, Emily. I've given you every chance to tell the truth, to come clean, but you've kept lying. And I deserve better than that. After a long pause, Emily finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean for it to happen. I was just so unhappy, Mike. I felt lost. Her words stung, but Mike forced himself to stay calm. And instead of talking to me, you turned to someone else? After everything we've been through, that's the choice you made. She looked down, unable to respond. Mike could see the weight of her actions finally settling on her. But it was too little, too late. He'd spent months hoping she'd find a way back to him, that she'd choose honesty over deception. But seeing her here, her guilt evident yet still deflecting responsibility, he knew there was no going back. With a heavy heart, he made his decision. Emily, he said, his tone cold and final, I can't do this anymore. I can't live in a marriage built on lies and betrayal. I want a divorce. The words hung in the air, and he could see the shock on her face, as if she hadn't truly believed he'd go through with it. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of fear and disbelief. Mike, please, I'm sorry. I know I messed up, but we can work through this. We've been together for so long. Mike shook his head, cutting her off. I loved you, Emily. I trusted you with everything I had, and you threw it away. This isn't something we can just work through. You made a choice, and now you have to live with it. Emily's face crumpled, and for the first time, Mike saw genuine remorse in her eyes. But it wasn't enough. He'd been hurt too deeply, betrayed too completely, to simply forgive and forget. He stood up, his expression resolute. I'll contact a lawyer tomorrow. We'll figure out the details. But as far as I'm concerned, this marriage is over. Without waiting for her response, he walked out of the room, leaving her sitting alone, tears streaming down her face. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done, but he knew it was the only way forward. In the days that followed, Mike threw himself into the divorce process, determined to close this painful chapter of his life. He and Emily divided their assets, set up a custody arrangement for the kids, and began the arduous task of unraveling a life they'd built together. Each step was a painful reminder of what they'd lost, but Mike knew it was necessary. He couldn't keep holding onto a relationship that had betrayed him so deeply. The turning point came when, during one of their final discussions, Emily broke down, finally admitting the full extent of her regret. Mike, she said, her voice choked with emotion, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I ruined everything, and I'll probably regret it for the rest of my life. But please, just know that I loved you. I still do. Mike looked at her, his face calm but unreadable. Emily, I believe you, but sometimes love isn't enough. Trust is just as important, and you broke that. I can't live in a marriage where I'm always wondering if you're telling the truth. We both deserve a chance to move on. As he walked away from that final conversation, Mike felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. The pain was still there, but he could feel himself healing, step by step. He'd done what he needed to do. He'd stood up for himself, demanded the truth, and found the strength to let go. And as he looked toward the future, he knew that this experience, as painful as it was, had made him stronger. He was ready to rebuild, to find happiness again, and to surround himself with people who valued honesty and loyalty as much as he did. Thank you for watching this story. If you were as captivated by this journey as I was, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life stories. And let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Mike's situation? Let's keep the conversation going. As Mike moved forward with the divorce, he was prepared to face the intense emotions and logistical challenges of separating his life from Emily's. What he wasn't prepared for, though, was how the process would uncover hidden truths and spark new conflicts that neither of them saw coming. One day, As he and Emily sat with their respective lawyers to discuss the division of assets, an unexpected issue arose. Emily's lawyer produced a document, a secret bank account under Emily's name. Mike stared at the paperwork, stunned. This was money he had no idea existed, and Emily's reaction made it clear she'd hoped to keep it that way. Emily flushed as Mike's lawyer questioned her, trying to explain away the account as extra savings she'd set aside. But the timing, coupled with her recent behavior, left Mike with no doubt that this was money she'd hidden as a backup plan, just in case things didn't go her way. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Not only had she betrayed him with Jason, but she'd been preparing for an escape all along. Mike's anger was immediate and undeniable, but he managed to keep his composure. He leaned forward, his voice low and controlled. "So, this was your plan all along, wasn't it? You knew things wouldn't last, so you made sure you'd come out ahead." Emily's lawyer stepped in, trying to mitigate the damage, but Mike wasn't backing down. The betrayal felt fresh all over again, and he could see from Emily's face that she was realizing just how deep her actions had cut. This wasn't just about Jason anymore. It was about the life they'd built and the trust she'd shattered in every possible way. After the tense meeting, Mike walked away feeling a mix of anger, betrayal, and exhaustion. The fight was draining, but something within him felt strangely relieved. Every revelation, every conflict seemed to push him closer to a place of acceptance. He was beginning to realize that Emily wasn't the person he'd thought she was, and that recognition, painful as it was, helped him detach. Over the next few weeks, Mike and Emily's interactions grew increasingly distant. Their conversations became strictly business, focused solely on the logistics of dividing their lives. With each passing day, Mike felt himself letting go a little more, emotionally distancing himself from the memories and promises they'd once shared. But just as things seemed to be settling into a predictable rhythm, Mike received a call from his son, Luke. Luke was visibly upset, his voice shaking as he asked if they could meet. Mike's stomach sank. He knew this had something to do with the divorce, and he feared the impact it was having on his children. They met at a nearby park, where Luke wasted no time, his emotions spilling over as he spoke. "Dad, I saw Mom with that guy, Jason. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to make things worse, but I don't understand why she's doing this to us." Hearing his son's pain was like a dagger to Mike's heart. He'd been so focused on his own anger and betrayal that he hadn't fully realized the weight of the situation on his kids. They'd been innocent bystanders, swept up in the storm without any say. Mike pulled Luke into a hug, his voice calm but firm. "Listen, Luke, none of this is your fault. Your mom and we made mistakes, but this doesn't change how much we love you. I know it's hard to understand right now, but things will get better. I promise." Luke nodded, his face a mix of anger and sadness, and Mike knew that he had to make sure his kids felt supported, even if he and Emily couldn't reconcile. He vowed to keep their well-being at the forefront of his mind, no matter how difficult the situation became. As the weeks turned into months, the divorce proceedings moved forward, inching closer to finalization. Mike felt a weight lifting off his shoulders as he neared the end of the process. But one last confrontation lay ahead, a final meeting to sign the papers and officially end their marriage. On the day of the signing, Mike entered the room, his heart heavy but resolute. He'd prepared himself for this moment, reminding himself that it was the last step in reclaiming his life. Emily was already there, looking distant and worn, as if the months of tension had taken a toll on her, too. They both sat silently, their lawyers reviewing the final paperwork, and the gravity of the moment settled over them. As they signed the papers, Emily hesitated, her pen hovering over the page. She glanced up at Mike, her expression vulnerable. "Mike, I want you to know I'll always regret how things ended. I thought I wanted something different, but I realize now that I lost something irreplaceable." Mike looked at her, feeling a mixture of sorrow and detachment. Her words meant little to him now. They were too late, spoken from a place of guilt rather than genuine understanding. He simply nodded, offering her a small, polite smile. "Take care of yourself, Emily. With that, he signed the final page and it was done. Years of marriage, memories, and dreams reduced to a signature on a line. In the aftermath, Mike felt a surprising sense of calm. He hadn't expected peace, but as he walked out of the building, he realized he was free. Free from the lies, the betrayal, and the constant doubt. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted, leaving him with room to breathe, to find himself again. Mike threw himself into a new routine, focusing on work, spending quality time with his kids, and rebuilding his life. He even started dating again, cautiously opening himself up to the possibility of new relationships. Slowly, he began to heal, rediscovering the man he was before the heartbreak, but with a new strength forged from the trials he'd endured. Through it all, his kids became his anchor. He made an effort to be present, attending their games, listening to their stories, and supporting them in ways he hadn't fully understood before. They had been hurt too, and together, they found a way to heal, creating new memories and cherishing the bond that kept them strong. Months later, Mike ran into an old friend, someone who'd known him before he met Emily. They caught up, reminiscing about the past, and Mike realized how much he'd changed. The pain had left its mark, but he'd grown, and he was finally ready to leave the past behind. Looking back, he saw his journey as one of resilience, of learning to let go of what he couldn't control and finding strength within himself. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was his life, and for the first time in a long time he felt hopeful. If you've enjoyed this story of resilience and recovery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And in the comments below, share your thoughts. What would you have done in Mike's shoes? Let's continue the conversation. As Mike started adjusting to life on his own, he poured his energy into work, his children, and his budding relationship with Laura, the friend he'd reconnected with. But just as he was beginning to find a sense of stability, another unexpected twist threw him back into the storm. Late one evening, while he was unwinding at home, his phone rang. It was Emily. The sight of her name on his screen filled him with a familiar knot of tension. They'd been co-parenting relatively peacefully, but he hadn't expected her to reach out for anything personal. Still, he answered, his voice steady, though his pulse quickened. "Hello." Emily's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Mike, I know this is sudden, but I really need to talk to you. In person. It's important." Against his better judgment, Mike agreed to meet her the next day, curious but wary. The following afternoon, he found himself sitting across from Emily in a quiet cafe. She looked anxious, her hands twisting nervously as she searched for the right words. Finally, she took a deep breath, meeting his eyes. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the divorce," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I realize how badly I messed things up. And not just with you, but with our family." Mike listened, his expression guarded. He'd heard apologies before, but this felt different. There was a weight in her tone, a sincerity that caught him off guard. Emily continued, her eyes clouded with regret. "I thought I wanted freedom, excitement, but all I found was emptiness. Jason, it was never real. He left when things got hard, and I realized too late that I threw away the most important thing in my life for nothing." Her words struck a chord, stirring emotions Mike had thought he'd buried. She seemed genuinely remorseful, and he could see the pain in her eyes as she admitted her mistakes. But as much as he sympathized, he knew he couldn't go back to the way things were. Too much had happened, and he was already moving forward with his life. "Emily," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I appreciate you telling me this. I know it couldn't have been easy, but we can't change the past. I've moved on, and I think it's time for both of us to focus on our own paths." Emily nodded, a trace of sadness in her expression. "I understand, Mike. I wanted you to know that I regret everything. Losing you, losing our family, it was the biggest mistake of my life." As they parted ways, Mike felt a strange sense of closure. The conversation had been heavy, but it had also allowed him to let go of the last remnants of anger he'd been holding on to. He'd made peace with his past, and he was ready to fully embrace his future. In the weeks that followed, Mike focused on building a deeper relationship with his kids and strengthening his connection with Laura. He could finally breathe without the weight of betrayal hanging over him, and he found joy in the simple moments. A family dinner, a quiet evening with Laura, a weekend hike with his children. But life wasn't quite done testing him. Just as he was settling into this new chapter, an unexpected opportunity arose at work. Mike's boss offered him a promotion that would require relocating to a new city. A fresh start, but also a huge decision that would impact everyone around him. The offer was tempting. It came with a significant raise and the chance to lead a major project, something he'd always dreamed of. But the thought of uprooting his children weighed heavily on him. Sarah and Luke were in high school, and he didn't want to disrupt their lives more than the divorce already had. He spent days mulling over the decision, torn between his career aspirations and his responsibilities as a father. Laura was supportive, reassuring him that she'd be there no matter what he chose. But even her encouragement couldn't ease his uncertainty. Finally, he sat down with his kids to discuss the offer, determined to make them a part of the decision. To his surprise, both Sarah and Luke were more understanding than he'd expected. "Dad, if this is what you want, we're with you," Sarah said, her voice full of conviction. "We've been through so much already. I think we can handle this." Luke nodded, a hint of excitement in his eyes. "Yeah, Dad, I think it could be cool. A fresh start sounds kinda awesome." Their support gave Mike the confidence he needed to take the leap. With his kids' blessing, he accepted the promotion, and within a few months, they were packing up their old home and preparing to move. It was a bittersweet process, filled with memories of the life they'd shared. But Mike knew it was the right step forward. The move marked a new beginning for their family. In the new city, Mike threw himself into his work, finding fulfillment in his career while balancing his responsibilities as a father and partner. He and Laura continued to grow closer, their relationship deepening as they navigated the challenges of this new phase together. One evening, as he sat on the porch of their new home, watching his kids laugh and play in the yard, Mike felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The journey had been hard, filled with pain, betrayal, and heartbreak, but he'd emerged stronger, more resilient, and surrounded by people who genuinely cared about him. Looking back, he realized that the hardships he'd faced had shaped him into the person he was today. He'd learned to value honesty, loyalty, and the importance of family. And as he watched Sarah and Luke, he knew he'd do everything in his power to provide them with the stability and love they deserved. In the end, Mike's story wasn't about loss. It was about rediscovery. He'd found himself, his strength, and his capacity for forgiveness. And though the scars remained, they served as a reminder of how far he'd come, of the resilience he'd built and the love he'd reclaimed. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you found Mike's story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales of resilience and growth. And let us know in the comments, how would you have handled things in Mike's shoes? As Mike settled into life in the new city, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in years. The fresh start had done wonders for him and his family, and he could see the positive impact it was having on everyone, especially his kids. Sarah and Luke quickly adapted to their new school, making friends and finding their rhythm. The change, though daunting at first, seemed to be exactly what they all needed. For Mike, this new chapter represented more than just a geographical shift. It was a personal transformation. He had endured heartbreak, betrayal, and the dismantling of everything he thought was secure, only to emerge stronger, more focused, and more appreciative of the people around him. Through all the challenges, he'd learned the importance of honesty, resilience, and staying true to himself. Laura, too, became an integral part of his life in the new city. Their relationship had blossomed steadily, building on mutual respect, understanding, and a deep emotional connection. Unlike before, Mike approached this relationship with a newfound wisdom. He was cautious yet open, knowing the importance of trust and communication. He and Laura supported each other through every transition, finding joy in the simple moments they shared. One evening, after a long day at work, Mike sat down with his kids to discuss their journey over the past year. It was a quiet night, and as they sat around the dinner table, He encouraged them to reflect on everything they'd been through. "Do you ever think about everything that's happened?" he asked, looking at Sarah and Luke with a gentle smile. Sarah nodded, a thoughtful look on her face. "Yeah, Dad. At first I was angry and hurt, but now I think it made us stronger. We've all changed a lot, and I feel like we've found a new kind of happiness." Luke chimed in, his usual energy softened by the sincerity in his eyes. "It was tough, but I wouldn't change anything. We're closer now, and I think we're better because of it." Mike felt a surge of pride as he listened to his kids. They had been through so much, yet they'd come out stronger, wiser, and more connected. It was a testament to their resilience and to the importance of family. Despite the hardships, they had found a way to support each other, to grow together, and to create a new life filled with hope and promise. As the days turned into months, Mike realized that he'd finally reached a place of peace. The memories of the past no longer held the power they once did. Instead, they served as a reminder of his strength, of the journey he'd taken to get here. He'd moved beyond the pain, letting go of the anger and resentment that had once consumed him. He was finally free. In one of his final conversations with Emily, they'd managed to reach a place of mutual respect. Though they could never return to what they'd once been, they'd found a way to co-parent amicably, prioritizing their children's happiness above all else. Mike could see the regret in her eyes, the understanding that she'd lost something precious, and while he felt sympathy for her, he knew he'd made the right choice to move on. Their story had ended, but it had paved the way for new beginnings, for both of them. The climactic events of the past year had transformed him in ways he hadn't thought possible. He'd found a new job, a new home, and a new love, but most importantly, he'd found himself. He no longer felt like a man defined by his circumstances or his past. Instead, he was someone who had taken control of his life, who had chosen happiness, resilience, and growth. In a symbolic gesture, he put away the old photo albums, placing them in storage. They were a part of his life, memories he'd cherish, but they no longer defined him. His present was brighter, filled with new memories, new goals, and a sense of purpose that gave him hope for the future. As Mike and Laura shared their first holiday together, surrounded by Sarah, Luke, and a close circle of new friends, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. They gathered around a cozy fire, laughter and warmth filling the room. It was a moment of pure joy, a culmination of the journey he'd been on. A journey from heartache to healing, from loss to renewal. Looking around the room, Mike realized that he'd created a life he could be proud of. He had people who loved him, who respected him, and who valued him for who he was. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer caused him pain. Instead, they reminded him of the strength he'd found within himself. In the final moments of reflection, Mike looked at Laura, his heart full of peace. "Thank you for being here," he said softly, taking her hand. "For everything." Laura smiled, her eyes filled with warmth and understanding. "We're in this together, Mike. Always." With that, they raised their glasses, toasting to new beginnings, to resilience, and to the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. It was a story of transformation, of finding light in the darkest of times, and of discovering that sometimes the most painful experiences lead to the most beautiful chapters of our lives. Thank you for watching and being part of Mike's journey. If his story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and growth. And as always, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep this conversation going.